Hello and welcome to Superpower Broadcasting. My name is Kevin, and in this video I'm going to be discussing how we are living in the era of cringe. When I say this, I am talking about the ascension of populism. I'm talking about the emergence of a political discourse in the West, which is inherently toxic and very much beholden to the interests of our enemies abroad. Now, if you follow me on Twitter, for example, you'll know that I identify myself as an anti-populist. Now, I don't normally like to use such anti-type terms. I don't usually like to use negative terms to identify my political perspective. I normally use pro terms, positive terms. I call myself liberal hawk. I call myself, neoconservative. I don't call myself an anti-isolationist. That's kind of implicit in the term liberal hawk, right? But when it comes to populism, populism is so much of a cancerous movement in Western society that I can only really directly identify myself as the direct counter to that. And so anti-populist in that sense is fitting. Now, when it comes to populism in general, I will have a video discussing populism in more detail because I consider populism a cancer. But as it relates to the issue of the era of cringe, it's not just about populism. It's about this trend in our political discourse and our political way of organizing society that we have seen in the last decade or so a transition from what was more or less a semblance of normalcy, professionalism, and expertise in government, regardless of the party that won. So, for example, if you live in the United States of America, you had, whether it was a Republican or a Democrat, you had a professional leader, a qualified candidate who had relevant experience and who surrounded themselves with experts. And so George W. Bush is an example of this, where George W. Bush had shortfalls. He wasn't necessarily the brightest person, but he surrounded himself with experts. He knew to make up that gap. He surrounded himself with people like, Karl Rove, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, very, very smart, talented people, regardless of what you think of them. I mean, it's just, it's a fact that Rumsfeld ran two very successful companies, for example. He's a smart guy. Cheney ran Halliburton, for example. These are very smart, talented people. And when it comes to Barack Obama, of course, you saw that he surrounded himself with people such as Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, people who had decades-long history of not just public service, but also, other talents and whatnot. Very people that would be described as elite, but who could also be described as experts, right? And I mean, Stephen Colbert had that line several years back. I believe it was during the Obama administration that, elite used to mean good. It used to mean, top level, and it's still used in that sense if we're talking about, elite military squadrons or whatnot. It's always used as a positive. It's always used to mean, based. But when it comes to politics, all of a sudden elite is seen as this negative. It's seen as something that you want to avoid being, which is kind of goofy. But and that goes back to what I was talking about the era of cringe, because personally I want to be governed by somebody that's smarter than me. I don't want an idiot responsible for the future and security of the country. That's not something that you play around with. You don't want a clown in office regardless of what party they are. The United Kingdom is another example of this, where you used to have, Tony Blair as an example, Margaret Thatcher, different parties. You had, David Cameron even. Regardless of whether you're Labour or Conservative, there were qualified, talented people that came into office. Now, you can disagree over the politics, economics of what they stood for, but it's indisputable that these were all very smart, clever, talented people. But in recent years, we've seen a transition from this culture of expecting high standards from elected officials to now demanding celebrity culture from them, demanding, to have our leaders be people that are seen as, the Trump type, that are seen as these, schoolyard popularity type of champions and whatnot. And and this isn't just the case in Western countries either. You see this sort of thing emerging in countries throughout Asia too that have democratic elections and everything. You see this in India with Narendra Modi, for example. It's really I can only describe it as the era of cringe, because what happens, of course, with all this is that this ascension of populism is originally touted as anti-establishmentarian. It's touted as very much in the interest of the people and claims to speak for and on behalf of the people. But of course, if you've watched my video, The Battle of Establishments, you'll know that, and this goes back to what my friend Reese of Nightmare Fuel was talking about, is that it's not so much establishment versus anti-establishment, because the anti-establishment in the West is beholden to and plays into the interests of the establishment in the Kremlin, in Russia, and in communist China, for example. So what we see, of course, is that it's not about establishment versus anti-establishment. It's about establishment versus establishment. It's about the Kremlin versus Washington. And in that battle, I'm on the side of Washington. I'm on the side of Western establishments, because I happen to agree with Western values of liberalism, democracy, accountable government, etc. What the establishment of the Kremlin stands for is the division of the West, the breaking apart of our institutions, the liberal order that's been constructed over the last 70 years in the wake of the defeat of fascism in Europe. It ultimately is the cult of personality around one man, Vladimir Putin, KGB Vlad, right? It's about the lust for power, prestige, glory, and of course the personal enrichment of Vladimir Putin. That's what the anti-establishment movement ultimately fights for in the Western countries. And populism, of course, was stoked by the Kremlin, because the Kremlin doesn't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican, if you're Labor, conservative, whatnot. All that they care about is that you're crazy, that you're going to hurt the interests of the country that you are elected to represent, and that you're ultimately going to serve the interests of Moscow. And this is really clear, because the era of cringe doesn't just include Donald Trump. I could talk about Donald Trump ad nauseum. Everybody talks about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a cringeworthy man. He's full of cringe. Every time he tweets, every time he gives a speech, every time he gives a photo op or whatnot, it is filled with gaffes. It is filled with this profound detachment from the reality of life. It's filled with apologetics and praise for the most brutal despots in the world, such as Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, Bashar Assad. And my prediction, and we've talked about this with the Hawks before, is that he will probably come around on Iran too, and he'll probably begin praising the Ayatollah, because he'll say, well, the Ayatollah, he's a strong leader. He, when he speaks, his people listen. He's a great, powerful, strong dude or whatever, just as he does with Kim Jong-un. Because, yeah, sure, his fan base, they don't really like Islam very much. Yeah, well, they also don't really like communism, yet he's out there singing the praises and writing beautiful love letters to the chairman of the Communist Party in North Korea, the Korean Workers' Party. So they don't actually care about all that. They just want a strong dictator, right? They don't care if they're communist, if they're Muslim. It doesn't matter. They are anti-democrats. They are more comfortable being in an axis with Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, and the Ayatollah than they are being in an alliance with Justin Trudeau Angela Merkel, and used to be Theresa May. But of course, Boris Johnson is another one of these guys that I would lump into the era of cringe. He's a cringeworthy guy too. He's a goofball. He's a clown of the earth, just like Donald Trump. But all these people that I've been listing off are, they're all nominally right-wing people, conservatives, etc. Now, we can have a debate about to what extent is Donald Trump actually a conservative and everything, and because, of course, in his own personal life, he would be described by the evangelicals as a heathen, right? But they still vote for him. They still elected him. The thing is, it's not just about that. Jeremy Corbyn is one of the first people that comes to mind when I think of the era of cringe, because the Labour Party in the United Kingdom used to have Tony Blair. Tony Blair, he helped liberate Iraq from the Republic of Terror, right, under Saddam Hussein. He was a very smart, talented leader. He was a liberal hawk, in essence, right? Now we have Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn is more cringeworthy than your typical tanky. Your tanky of the old Bolshevik type tankies, right? They were bad. They were despicable. They defended people such as Joseph Stalin. They defended people such as Mao Zedong, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, etc. Jeremy Corbyn's worse than that. And you might ask, well, how does it get worse than defending the most brutal tyrants in history, the most brutal socialist tyrants in history? Well, it gets worse because he not only conducts apologetics for them and conducts apologetics for Bashar Assad, Bashar the Butcher in Syria. That's, Nazbol type leader. He conducts apologetics for religious fundamentalists. So the old tankies, old Bolshevik types, they used to view religion as the opiate of the masses. They used to view it as an enemy. They would defend brutal tyrants who ran nominally atheist states. But Jeremy Corbyn, he does all that, plus he defends Hamas. He's defended Iran, the Ayatollah in Iran. So he's worse. He's objectively worse. It is despicable. And people talk about the progression of history that, things will get better as we go on. Well, this is a case of the era of cringe. No, we were actually better off in terms of political culture 10 years ago than we are today. That's objectively true. Politics, economics, foreign policy, etc. in the West. We were much stronger. We had a much more forceful presence in the world. We were much more proud of our liberal values and proud to champion the liberal order in the world, to try to expand democracy. And now we have this coupling of just this profound defeatism in the West, the sense that, we're all just a bunch of, privileged, whatever, that we are the bad guys in the world in essence. And we should, quote unquote, respect other cultures, which is a moral relativist euphemism for let dictators around the world slaughter their own people, because democracy isn't a universal good. We should only have democracy for whites in the West. We shouldn't have democracy for Chinese people. They have their own culture, right? Because it's not like they're fighting for it right now and getting curb stomped by a bunch of, jackboots serving the Communist Party. So there's this very much condescending attitude by these people towards, other races, other nations around the world. They claim, to believe in things like the ethno-state and whatnot. In other words, human rights for whites, to hell with everyone else. They believe in things such as, this, and it's ironic because they often cite Edward Said, they often cite Orientalism to make the case that the neocons are evil, no good hawks and stuff, and that, we don't understand the nuances and the self-determination of the people of, the Orient or whatever they would call it, of Asia. Well, no, that's actually just a very sort of intellectual and polite euphemism for let's let the people of Asia be oppressed by a bunch of strongman dictators, and let's have them pillage and plunder and suck the lifeblood out of their countries, because who are we to tell those dictators that democracy is better? So there's this defeatist guilt in the West. But it's also coupled by an outright apologia for those dictators now. It's not even just the guilt thing, and there is a very active movement now in the West that sees these systems as better, and it's on both sides. We have the alt-right, we have the fascists. They argue that Assad is great, that he's this champion of, Christian rights or whatever. They argue, it's funny, they argue similar stuff about Iran. Now, Iran, nobody's making the case that the Ayatollah of Iran is looking out for Christians, but they see him as fighting the Jews, so he's okay in their books, right? So there's that. That's another part of the era of cringe, is just the rampant anti-Semitism. I know that there was a study, I believe it was by the Anti-Defamation League, that found that at least in the United States, about 73%, I believe it was, of the anti-Semitism was coming from the right wing, and the rest was coming from the left wing. Well, in Europe, it's a bit more 50-50, because, of course, the Labour Party of the UK is pretty anti-Semitic, generally speaking. Jeremy Corbyn, his ideas, his rhetoric lends itself to anti-Semitism. He's definitely pro-Hamas. Hamas seeks to kill Jews in the world. They seek to do suicide bombings to kill innocent Jewish people. They lob rockets into Israel all the time. And if it wasn't for the Iron Dome system, they would kill a lot more people. So we should be thankful that the United States and Israel are allies, and that the United States has provided technical assistance to Israel to save lives, right? Because Hamas has lobbed thousands of old school rockets their way. And it's a fortunate thing that they don't have any more sophisticated technology, because they'd be able to kill a lot more people if they did. Iran has more sophisticated technology. They have the largest ballistic missile force of any non-nuclear country. And so for them to now be seeking to acquire nuclear weapons, well, that's a big problem. And the era of cringe, the ascension of populism, this is really problematic, because it would be one thing if I were here telling you about how it was bad because it's going to delay social progress, how the era of cringe sees this, unholy alliance of anti-feminist neckbeards and Bernie bros and Chapo, trap house type losers, and alt-righties, and so on and so forth, and Nazbols and everything, and they all are going to, divide and render our society more and more extreme. That would be one thing, of course, because I care about social issues, but it has grave ramifications for our foreign policy. Because even though the era of cringe, even though populism by and large focuses on economics and social issues, the foreign policy that goes along with it is inherently isolationist. It is, they use the euphemism, non-interventionist, as if that is somehow so much better. I mean, if you knew what was going on in the world, you would see non-intervention as a very dirty term as well, right? Non-interventionism means stand by as other people get gassed and murdered and do nothing about it. That's what non-interventionism means. But, of course, when it comes down to it, isolationism still has those connotations of the Nazi apologists from the 40s that non-interventionism doesn't. But, again, that's part of the era of cringe, because non-intervention should have the same degree of negative connotations associated to it, because Assad is killing 600,000 people right now. He already has, and he's racking up that kill count. The non-interventionists, they conduct apologetics for him. And this spans the left wing and the right wing. This isn't just, David Duke. This isn't just Richard Spencer. This isn't just, the Jared Taylor type people. This isn't just, the fascies, the usual suspects of who you would see as having a very anti-Semitic foreign policy. And so, of course, they're going to be isolationists. Of course, they're going to side with this socialist tyrant because he fights the Jews, right? No, it's not just them. It includes a lot of people on the left, too. So the era of cringe, who are some of the stars in the era of cringe, right? Because that's what we're going to get into here. Because we can talk about ideas. Ideas are important. Ideas make the world go around. But ideas must be propagated from individuals, and we should take a few moments here to discuss the stars of the era of cringe, right? And so, who are some of the most notorious propagators of this, disgusting and filthy era that we're living in? Well, one of the prominent candidates who comes to mind, one of the big stars, he must be so proud, is Kremlin Caio. He runs the channel Secular Talk on YouTube. Now, that channel name is a bit of a misnomer, right? Because what are you going to see if you go on Secular Talk? You're going to see a defense of Islamic theocracies. You're going to see a defense of Vladimir Putin and his union of the Russian Orthodox Church and the mafia state, the far-right petrostate in Russia. What are you going to see? You're going to see a defense of Hamas. You're going to see a defense of Islamic terrorism. You're going to see a defense of the most egregious and despicable elements in the world today. There is not that much about secular talk. And so, of course, Kremlin Caio, he is definitely one of the primary champions in the era of cringe. He is not a very good dude if you're somebody who values liberalism, if you're somebody who believes that brown people should have human rights too. That shouldn't just be, a Western thing. That human rights are a universal good, that democracy is a universal good. You won't see that from secular talk. You'll see this moral relativist degeneracy. You'll see this defense of everything that is anti-secular, everything that is illiberal, as long as it's touted as anti-imperialist. If you package genocide as anti-imperialist, Kremlin Caio will be in your corner, and he will defend you as a champion fighting the military-industrial complex of America. Of course, you'll probably be buying arms from the military-industrial complex of Russia, but hey, they're anti-imperialists, so it's okay. A side note here, of course, one of the things that you'll see in the era of cringe is that anti-imperialism has no meaning anymore because Russia annexed Crimea. That is one of the most imperialist actions that you can do as a country. Annex territory. That's basically the definition of imperialism. Fascist Russia is an empire. They annexed Crimea. They annexed part of northern Georgia. They have other areas in the Caucasus where they've done similar shenanigans. They are not good, and of course they want to take over Estonia. They hate Estonia. Estonia is a thorn in their side because the leader of Estonia back in the day, after they gained independence, sought to join NATO and read Milton Friedman and turned their economy into a very prosperous capitalist economy with a free market and liberal values. And even though they are 1% the population of Russia, I believe they're about 3% the economy of Russia. So they are kicking Putin's ass, right? But they have the protection of NATO, which is good. The era of cringe sees the withering away of the resolve of NATO. It sees the withering away of the conviction that what we stand for in the West is a universal good. It sees the emergence of moral relativism as the new default. And moral relativism, well, it may start with the idea that, we have democracy and liberalism in the West, and other people around the world have fascism and dictatorships, and that's just how things should be. And if you try to change that, you're an evil, no good neocon hawk. Well, that's a beginning place in the era of cringe. My prediction is that the goalposts will be moved further and further and further towards arguing, well, hey, look, they have fascism and dictatorships over there. Why can't we have that here? And we see this with the alt-right. We see it with the tankies. We see it with the Jeremy Corbyn types, the Glenn Greenwald types who really lend themselves to authoritarian strongmen and the emergence of that in the West. As long as it's touted as anti-imperialism, as long as it's touted in whatever economic populist package that they have. And it really doesn't matter if they're right-wing or left-wing because there isn't that much of a difference when it comes to populism. It's more or less the same rhetoric. It's more or less the same socialist, nationalist economics. And it's the same isolationist foreign policy. There really isn't that much of a difference. The largest difference between the left and the right these days as it relates to the era of cringe and populism is aesthetics and the overt emphasis on race, even though there, as I've talked about, there is anti-Semitism in the left too. So the whole racial thing is also kind of misguided to say that it's only on the right that they focus on that kind of stuff. There are a lot of leftist anti-Semites. Karl Marx was one of them, right? And he's one of the progenitors of, the whole tanky ideology and everything. So when it comes down to this, what we see with the Era of Cringe is that it really undermines our standing in the world. It doesn't just render our social discourse toxic. It doesn't just see the emergence of neckbeards and tankies as the new defaults, but it sees the weakening of America and NATO on the world stage. It sees the fracture of NATO, and we're seeing this right now. Brexit is a perfect example in the economic metric of the Era of Cringe. Brexit was one of the dumbest things that's happened in the West in the last decade. Absolutely. It's one of the most irrational things that any country could do, to leave a free trade organization like the European Union, to leave an organization that has kept the peace between the great powers of Europe for 7 decades, to just leave that. And of course, if the other countries of Europe followed suit, eventually we'd be back in a case where Germany and Britain are looking at going to war. And what's that going to do? That's just going to help Russia's strategic interests. They will play the two powers against one another. They are playing the different sides against one another within the West right now. Part of the Era of Cringe is this faux division that we have between the radical left and the radical right, where they both serve the interests of the Kremlin. And they're both pretty explicit about it too. Kremlin shill Jill Stein had dinner with Vladimir Putin. There's a picture of her. She's seated fittingly on Putin's left. And you know who's seated fittingly on Putin's right? Michael Flynn, the traitor who took $500,000 illegally from the government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, and did not register as a foreign agent, and went on to work for the Trump campaign. And I believe he was fired within 17 days over malfeasance, but he was a far-right lunatic. And Kremlin shill Jill Stein is a far-left lunatic. And it's so fitting, that image, because yes, she's on Putin's left and he's seated on Putin's right, and there they are together having dinner, and everything's cozy and warm, and they're in the den of the fascist beast. And that's how this goes. That is the Era of Cringe. It is the coalescence of the left and the right in to serve the interests of the Kremlin. And the interests of the Kremlin have no horse in the battle. They don't care if the far left prevails or the far right prevails in the West. They only care that the West is weakened, rendered impotent, preferably of its own volition. They don't want to have to do any work, right? They want to get us to ISO-cuck ourselves. That's their goal. Going back to Alexander Dugin's book, The Foundations of Geopolitics, from I believe it was 1994, he said that it should be the goal of the Russian Federation to divide and play off the nationalists, the white nationalists against the black nationalists in the West. It should be the interest to seek out and co-opt every social cleavage in the West and use that to their advantage, because he knew, and Putin knows, and Putin has, he has the ear of Putin. They are aware that Russia would absolutely not fare well in a war with the West, that we would destroy Russia. They can talk tough about their nukes. They won't use the nukes. It is clear they would only use them as a last resort. They serve no utility in a war, because that's it. We still win. Sure, nukes are exchanged. Guess what? We still prevail. We're still NATO. The world goes on. Just a few 100 million people die in the end of the day. I believe an assessment by the Pentagon was that upwards of 500 million people would die if Russia and the U.S. went to war, but that the U.S., most of the rest of the world would go on fine. So it wouldn't be the end of the world, as a lot of the hyperbolist elements on the far left and right claim. But it also wouldn't be very good, and it would mean the end of Putin's regime. So he won't use nuclear weapons unless it gets to that point. So if we were smart, we would have a Brinksman in place who would seize upon Putin's weakness and take back what has been stolen from us. who would liberate northern Georgia, who would take back Crimea, who would ultimately close off and prevent the coalescence of Turkish and Russian interest into this axis of evil, the new axis of evil. What we see with the era of cringe is that our foreign policy has just gone so down the drain with Donald Trump. And again, I'm not really going to talk very much about Donald Trump here because in some ways he's just a symptom of the era of cringe. Sure, he's propagated it, but this is beyond Trump. This is beyond Boris Johnson. This is beyond Jeremy Corbyn. There is a profound and radically charged embrace of Kremlin talking points in our political discourse. People like to feel edgy. They like to feel hip. They like to feel cool. And what's a good way to do that? Well, what sounds really cool, a great way to spite your parents and to spite the elites in Washington is to lick the boots of the elites in Moscow. Because that's really what's going on. There's nothing cool about it. I mean, if you're going to be going around there saying how Russia's our friend and how Putin's this champion of Christendom and the white males, that doesn't make you cool. That doesn't make you hip. That doesn't make you edgy. It makes you a sad, pathetic bootlicker, isocuck for the leader of fascist Russia. It makes you beholden to the oligarchs of fascist Russia. So you're out there shilling, being a useful idiot, and they're out there robbing the Russian people so that they can buy a new yacht, new Rolls Royce, etc. So yeah, really, you're just serving a bunch of corporate interests in Russia, military-industrial complex interests in Russia, the dear leader interests in Russia. That's all that's going on here. It's not like you're really spiting the establishment. You're just deciding that you're going to sell your soul to a different establishment. Great. How wonderful. You must be so proud. That must be such a legacy that you want to be remembered for, right? When we look back on the history on who stood on which side in the battle of establishments, who stood on which side in the battle between liberalism and fascism. Bear in mind, of course, that Kremlin Caio has 700,000 subscribers, that Clint Greenwald has over 1 million followers on Twitter, that Dave Rubin has a huge platform, and they all bootleg for authoritarian strongmen around the world. This is the era of cringe. It sees everyone from libertarians to communists to anarchists to really anybody who calls themselves anti-center. If you're anti-center, that's a big red flag, because at this point the center is filled with, by and large, the rational people that are left, the moderates. I don't really care even whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. I mean, I have more in common. I'm a liberal, of course, but I have more in common with moderate Republicans than I do with the people that are on the fringes, the far end of the Democratic side. That people such as Ilhan Omar, people such as Tanky Tulsi Gabbard, the people who are the fastest to lick the boots of foreign dictators. I have nothing in common with them. On economics, they believe in socialism. Of course, the far right believes in socialism too. They just want it only for white people. Tucker Carlson is a great example of this. What does he want? He wants a wall. Well, every socialist society builds walls. Look at the Berlin Wall. That's a prime example. He wants, public works projects for white males. Well, that's pretty socialist thing. That's basically, Stalinism on economics. He wants to ban automation. Right there, anti-capitalist, right off the bat, anti-innovation, would stunt America. He believes in an isolationist foreign policy. Again, socialist, on Turkey. Look at North Korea. They have that. They are isolationist. It goes on and on. He's deeply socially conservative. Well, so are the people on the left. Who do they support? They support Hamas. Are Hamas liberals? Are they, weed-toking hippies? No, they're throwing gays off roofs. They are forcing women to cover up. They are sending children to blow themselves up in Israel to kill Jews. They are not liberals. They don't believe in liberalism. The far left is as conservative as the far right. I mean, they're tankies. They support Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was one of the most egregious patriarchal dictators in recent memory, right? So he despised women. He brought back, the Russian Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union, etc. But of course, when we're talking about the era of cringe, this is what it comes down to. The era of cringe can ultimately be summed up as the final and definitive proof of horseshoe theory. Now, as I've talked about before, it's not even really horseshoe theory. It's more, the idea of the political spectrum as more of a circle with the far right and the far left intertwined at the bottom. Because the horseshoe theory implies that there's still a gap, that there's still a difference between the two. But the more and more far right you get, the closer you get to the far left, that they really become intertwined and indistinguishable from one another. There is this common agreement that the center is bad. That really didn't seem to exist that much 10, 15 years ago. There, again, whether you were somebody who supported John McCain or Barack Obama, those were two normal, professional type people who surround themselves with experts, by and large. Sure, Sarah Palin had a lot of issues, and you could argue, well, Joe Biden isn't necessarily the most talented guy out there. He has a lot of gaffes, but these people are nothing compared to the populists. These people are nothing compared to the bat crap lunacy of people such as Donald Trump and the people around whom they surround themselves. So with some exceptions, Donald Trump, some noteworthy exceptions are John Bolton, Mike Pompeo. They're pretty smart. He originally had Rex Tillerson. Rex Tillerson, pretty smart guy. He obviously ran ExxonMobil. You don't get to do that without being smart, right? So there's that angle of it. But going back to what I was talking about, the big stars in the era of cringe, well, lackluster Lawrence Southern was one, Milo Yiannopoulos was another. These people more or less paved the way for the era of cringe. They aren't necessarily too big anymore. We see, Jordan Peterson is another example of this, of the era of cringe. And you might think, well, he's somebody who's got, degrees. He's somebody who's a smart professor. He's obviously talented. Well, no, not really. Because if you look at what he talks about, if you look at the main claims to fame that he ultimately has, the ideas that he's cited for and credited with as being inspirational by his fan base, they're all unoriginal. They're all just a regurgitation, a repackaging of Carl Jung, Arthur Schopenhauer, the Bible, etc. There's really nothing new there. There's nothing there. He is just, he's just plagiarism in a suit, in essence. And the only reason that he gets all this credit and is recognized as this inspiring figure is because, going back to the era of cringe, his fan base has never read anything published before 1996. So how would they know that he copied and plagiarized and whatnot? Now, I'm not saying that he plagiarized word for word. I'm not saying that he's somebody who, in the academic sense of the term, just copies paragraphs and uses them without giving due credit. No. What I am saying is that he's a charlatan. And what you'll see in the era of cringe is that charlatans and cults of personality are around everywhere. You see this with the libertarians, of course. They are very culty. You see this with the far left, that they are quick to gather around people who are extremely ineffectual, such as Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has had a career in government spanning, I believe, over 40 years, and yet he has hardly anything to show for it. Very few legislative accomplishments because he's incapable of compromise. He's incapable of negotiation. He's incapable of actually governing and representing the people. He's an obstinate and stubborn radical. That's in essence what he is. You have, so it's not just a left-wing versus right-wing thing. The era of cringe really can be summed up as the interweaving of economic left and the economic right, where it's no longer about capitalism versus socialism. It's about socialism for just whites or socialism for everybody, coupled with, on both sides, an isolationist foreign policy that demonizes Israel, that demonizes Jews around the world, and sees the bolstering and the propagation of the interests of our enemies, such as fascist Russia, Communist China, Iran, Hamas, North Korea. It goes on and on. These people have never met a foreign dictator they didn't fall in love with, whether they're right wing or left wing. Tulsi Gabbard is the epitome of the era of cringe on the left, and Donald Trump, Boris Johnson. They are likewise on the right, but it is the case that when we look at people such as Jeremy Corbyn, or when we look at people such as Tulsi Gabbard, for example, Tanky Tulsi, we talk about Naswell as being a meme, well, no, some memes are rooted in reality, right? Oh, it's just a meme, bro. No, no, no. National Socialism is a real thing. National Bolshevism is a real thing. Alexander Dugin is an unironic National Bolshevist. Tanky Tulsi Gabbard, what does she do? She packages her beliefs with this progressive image, this image of fighting for equality. Yet 2 years ago, she was calling gays homosexual terrorists and radical extremists, and her fan base is predominantly occupied and consists of libertarians, alt-right, the 4chan crowd, the 8chan crowd, etc. They are united by a hatred of Jews. They are united by a hatred of liberalism. They are united by a hatred of feminism. And in her, they see a champion of the patriarchal dictator who has slaughtered 600,000 people to hold on to his yacht and his palace. That, of course, being Bashar the Butcher. And what you see in the Era of Cringe, this is the last aspect of it that I'm going to get into. And I discussed this in my video, The Internet is a Total Failure. It is, and this, of course, is going back to Nightmare Fuel's contention that the Internet has been a disaster in terms of the promotion and access of information. It has served to make access to disinformation far easier. And what we see is that Kremlin talking points, Kremlin values, ultra-conservative sensibilities, a return to Dark Ages way of thinking, a defeatist and isolationist foreign policy. These all are able to propagate so much easier and are taken as a default. Where if you identify yourself as a neoconservative now, you are seen as somebody who must be, role-playing, who must be joking. But if you're somebody who sees yourself as a populist, people don't ask, wait, are you just LARPing? Are you for real? Are you a troll? No, that's seen as this new default. No, populism is cancer. And I'll have a video coming out soon about how populism is such a cancerous force in our society. And with respect to all of this, the Era of Cringe, my hope, my belief is that people will grow tired of being run by losers and incompetent clowns. And we will, as a society in the West, seek professional leadership again. And that it will swing far on the other end, and we will have a renaissance of neoconservatism and liberal hawks, and we will have a return to leaders such as Tony Blair and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and we will have a galvanized effort to take back what has been lost in the Era of Cringe to our enemies. But it may take some time. I don't know when this wave of populism is going to end. All that I can say is that it's very cringeworthy. It's disappointing to see people that have the most access to information living in the West embrace such troglodytic and backwards values and push to go back in time so hard and push to bootlick for fascist dictators so hard. It is unbelievably disgraceful and disgusting. And it would be comical if it didn't have such grave ramifications for the future and the present security of our civilization. So thank you for watching, YouTube.